Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 7th installment of Operation Safe Spaces Family Law Seminar. This evening, our presenters are psychiatrist Dr. June Price-Humphrey and clinical psychologist Dr. Lisa Cossy, who will be taking us through tonight's topic, the importance of expert reports for court. I will ask the ladies to do a quick introduction of themselves before getting started. And as always, we have a few housekeeping notes. This evening, again, the webinar will be presentation style with Dr. Cossy getting us started, followed by Dr. Price-Humphrey, followed by a Q&A session at the end. So as always, feel free to jot down any questions in the chat or unmute your mic or use the reaction for raising your hand. I also believe now you are all painfully aware that these meetings are being recorded. So if you haven't already done so, we would really appreciate if you could go ahead and complete and return the consent form, which is included in the 30-minute reminder email. As always, please check us out on social media, oss.246, both on IG and Facebook. I do also want to mention a slight change in the seminar. In order to be able to accommodate a shift in one of our final presenters' schedule, we have moved the final topic, which was Barbadian case studies in family law matters, to September 7th, Tuesday, September 7th. And in its place on Thursday, September 2nd, we will have an international perspective on high conflict divorce and separation, presented by US-based high conflict divorce coaches, Lisa Johnson and Chris Barry. And I will mention that again at the end of the session, just in case anybody missed it. So without further delay, I'll hand over to Dr. Cossy and we can get started. Dr. Cossy.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to start by thanking Robin and Operation Safe Space for the invitation to do this presentation, and for all of you for taking time out of your 2 hours out of your busy schedule to be here. My name is Lisa Cossy. I am a registered clinical psychologist in private practice in Barbados. I see mostly individuals for psychotherapy and some children. I also conduct psychoeducational and psychological assessments for children and adults, including children who are remanded or committed to the government industrial school. Prior to becoming a clinical psychologist, I worked as a probation officer, and I also worked at the battered women's shelter here in Barbados. So I do have some history and experience with the court system, as well as with domestic violence and abuse. And I've also conducted some court evaluations for custody assessments. Okay. So I'm going to get started. My understanding of my presentation today is to provide you with more information and a better understanding of psychological assessments for court matters involving domestic violence. So I am going to just get into that. So can everyone see? I just want to make sure everyone is able to see the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, we can.
Okay, all right, so I'll get started. All right, so I want to start by just quickly reviewing the types of domestic abuse, intimate partner abuse reported by persons who may visit a mental health professional. I'm assuming that that's probably earlier on in the sessions you had quite an in-depth overview of that. So I just really want to quickly review that for the purposes of today's session. So Obviously, physical abuse, this is the one that most people are very familiar with, involving hitting, kicking, slapping. Sometimes it may involve burning someone with a lighter, grabbing, shoving. So this is usually, at least from my knowledge and my experience in the battered women's shelter, the type of abuse that tends to be reported in Barbados. Then there is psychological abuse, so intimidation, threatening, playing mind games. Many times when people come to therapy for what we call psychological abuse, one of their biggest concerns is, is there something wrong with me? Do I have a memory problem? I've been told put something down here, and then I come back the next day and it's not there, or I'm told that this thing happened, but my memory suggests that it's something different. So lots of intimidation, destroying things that are important to the person. Then we have sexual abuse, which involves forcing someone to take part in a sexual act, sexual activity without their consent. Stalking. Stalking is actually also quite common here. I don't have any specific statistics. I'm just speaking from my clinical experience. But many women who report abuse also report being stalked by their partner, and stalked even after the relationship has ended, years after the relationship has ended. They may travel overseas or try to move overseas and continue to be stalked by that person. So you move to a different country and the person is still calling you saying, I'm outside of your mother's house and I'm watching her through the window. I'm thinking that tonight, maybe the night that I may, just go through and kill her and the rest of your family. So even after relationships have ended and people try to move on with their life, whether it's in another parish, another house, another country, still tends to be quite common for some victims of domestic abuse. We have isolation. So not everyone who obviously is abused may be physically abused. In some cases, it's just a matter of you live with me, you don't get to go to work. If you have to visit your family and friends, it's very limited. And I take you, I stay, I never leave you anywhere alone at any time. And this is all about power and control and keeping the person isolated away from in the rest of society. Obviously, for women who experience this, when the relationship does end, it's very difficult for them to start a life of their own. It's very difficult for them to even think of getting on a bus or getting into a car with someone else or going somewhere. To come to a therapist's office is often very difficult for them, because even though the relationship is over, because there is usually years of being very dependent and scared of their partner going somewhere on their own, becomes very difficult for them when the relationship ends to, reintegrate themselves back into typical society and typical daily activities. Financial, economic abuse. So the person is totally dependent on their partner. They may be forbidden to work, or if they're allowed to work, they are supposed to every payday give their paycheck or give their salary. You go to the bank, you withdraw all the money, you give it over to me, I pay the bills, I handle all the money, I may give you an allowance, but everything you need to get it through me. Abuse by immigration status. This is something that we may not hear a lot about in Barbados, especially the general public, but it does happen. So you are non-national, you get married to a Barbadian, or you're non-national in another country, you get married to someone, and the person threatens to destroy your immigration papers, or they threaten to get you, deported, or they are threatening to go in, or they delay the immigration process for you. So they may delay in filing certain papers needed to get your citizenship or permanent residence. If you live in a country where you don't speak the native language, they may prevent you from learning that language. Again, all of this in an effort to control, have power, keep the person scared and prevent them from thinking about leaving. Technology facilitated abuse. So abusive calls, messages. You may still be in the relationship with the person, and anytime you do anything that they don't like, they may go to social media, take over your accounts, publish or write things about you that are untrue. They may threaten to, or may even share images, intimate and personal images of you without consent. May track your phone, put a tracker and a tracer on your computer, on your car. And there's reproductive abuse. So this really is about an abuser refusing to use contraception or sabotaging your birth control methods. So sometimes we may see people come to social services or for social services, and you think, why does this 30-year-old woman have so many children, which it seems that, she's struggling to manage or be struggling to support, not knowing that really this woman never consented or never wanted to have all of these children. It's just the abusive situation that she lived in, and her partner's method of control is to keep her pregnant and having children. In other cases, it may be about forcing women to get abortions that they do not want. So what is the role for mental health professionals in cases where any type of abuse is reported? So typically, we provide therapeutic interventions through psychotherapy. And the reason that we tend to get involved in these cases is because domestic abuse against women is very negatively associated with their mental health. So partner abuse can put women, and there's a large body of research that shows that partner abuse puts women at even greater risk than typical people in the population for developing mental health conditions. These can include post-traumatic stress disorder, that's a very common one, depression, anxiety. Many women have disrupted sleep. They may have eating disorders and go on to develop substance abuse problems as they start to use substances as a way to cope and then become very dependent on them. And I know Dr. Price-Humphrey is going to go into mental health conditions associated with domestic abuse in greater detail. The other parties who also struggle with mental health conditions when it relates to domestic abuse or intimate partner abuse are the children who are involved in these relationships. So children who grow up in homes with domestic violence or abuse tend to have a higher risk of mental health conditions as well. So anxiety, depression, learning difficulties. So sometimes children are at school and teachers are thinking they're just being lazy or they don't complete their homework, not understanding that, well, last night daddy turned out the lights at 6 o'clock and no one could do anything, or we weren't allowed to have any food last night, or no, there's no one there. Mommy's never in a condition to, or hardly ever in a condition to really help us with our homework, not because she can't or she won't, but because of the effects of the abuse. Sometimes it makes it very difficult. You may also see anger management issues in children and problems with peer relationships. So difficulty with those social skills needed to relate to their peers in what are known as socially acceptable ways at times. The other way that mental health professionals can be involved in matters involving domestic abuse is through the provision of mental health or custody assessments. So sometimes these can be separate or they can be the two are incorporated into one. So there can be occasions where a court requests simply a mental health assessment. So we just want to know if there are some mental health issues that are going on with this person, as or both parties, or they can request a full custody assessment because either the parties are separating, and included in custody assessment is also usually should be mental health assessment should be included. So you can have a mental health assessment that stands on its own, or you can have a custody assessment which will also look at things like what are the best custody arrangements for the child, but then it also includes a mental health assessment of both parties. Now, the purpose of these assessments is to provide the court with an unbiased and objective evaluation of both parties, specifically looking at their mental and emotional health, their personality traits, their parenting capacity, and any risk factors, and also to assist the court in determining the issues before it. Now, I highlighted unbiased and objective in red, because sometimes I have clients who maybe I'm seeing in therapy, and then maybe 1-2 years later, they may say, well, now I'm going through a divorce or a separation, and the court has asked me to get an mental health evaluation or a custody evaluation, and could you do it? And so I have in my therapy contract, one of the clauses is that if you're involved or you later on become involved in a matter that requires an assessment, I typically would not serve as the evaluator, because it could come across as, you're my client, I would want what's in your best interest. So I may be biased, or I may not be able to be fully objective. Obviously, when you get these assessments, you as an attorney, you're looking for bias and objectivity. So if you're seeing an assessment where 80% of the assessment is written about one party and the other 20% is only about the other party, maybe that may raise some flags about you, about objectivity or any bias in the writing of the report. So those are things to be on the lookout for as an attorney. Now, when it gets to using evaluations for your cases, this is something that comes up very often for my colleagues and myself. So requesting evaluations, what's the procedure? My experience has been that in Barbados, there's really no structured procedure for requesting mental health or custody evaluations in general, and especially not in cases involving domestic or intimate partner abuse. So very often, I or my colleagues, we get a call from someone who says, I'm involved in a domestic violence matter, or I'm involved in a custody case, and I've been told I need to get a custody evaluation. And so I've been told to call around and find out, or someone gave me your number and told me to call you, or a specific judge told me that I should call you. Or you may get another request from a person who says, well, my partner is suggesting that I have significant mental health issues, and I've been told that it would be in my best interest to get a mental health evaluation, so I'm calling to request one for the court. And so you have to explain to persons that really you need a formal request. I need something coming in the mail or something coming by email, so that I have, 1, a paper trail, 2, I know that this is actually a legitimate request, and 3, if it could be that I may not know you, but I may know the other party, so I need to know who are the parties involved in the case. Another thing that can come up is that you may, come for an evaluation and bring your children, and then the other party, the husband, the boyfriend may say, well, I never gave permission for my child to be seen by a therapist, or I never gave permission for my child to be evaluated by a therapist. So for anyone who does work or is considering doing work in this area, certainly something to discuss with your clients. And usually I have to say to people, I really need either from your lawyer, but also from the court, a formal request for an evaluation. We can't just have you calling and requesting an evaluation. And that's also the procedure in other jurisdictions in the US and Canada and the UK. You don't just necessarily look for someone, call them up in the directory. You'd have something from the court saying that they've requested an evaluation. Okay, so that's the first part. The second thing then becomes, who do you ask to conduct an evaluation? So there are different types of psychologists in Barbados. The two main types are counseling psychologists and clinical psychologists. So you want to make sure that the person that you are requesting an evaluation from, first of all, it would be best if they are registered to practice. So registered just means that they have been before the paramedical council, they have taken all of their qualifications there, they were interviewed, their qualifications were deemed to be sufficient for them to be allowed to practice. And so they were given a letter to take down to the registrar to officially register to practice. You may also want someone who's been trained to conduct standardized psychological testing, because that, at least in other places, that's one of the recommendations for conducting these types of evaluations, that it's not just based on interviews, that there should be some objective measures that are administered as part of these evaluations. To determine whether or not that person has some experience in the area or enough experience to carry out, these types of evaluations as well. Now, the other question that tends to come up a lot for a psychologist when evaluations are requested is, what is the scope? So oftentimes when we get requests, when we get formal requests for evaluations, it's usually a very broad request for, we want an evaluation. But many times I have to say to lawyers, to ask judges, are there specific things that you want to know? Otherwise, you may just end up getting something that's very general, but it really does not help you to address the specific issues of the case, because each case, no matter what type of domestic abuse it is, each case is different. So you may have cases involving very young children. You may have cases involving older children. You may have cases where you need to figure out whether you want to know whether this person is a danger, whether or not this person should be allowed to see their children, what's the best custody arrangement for the children, what's in terms of mental health evaluation, is there something specific that you want to know? Do you just want a diagnosis? So oftentimes I find myself saying, well, I want to know if there's something specific that you want to know, because I want the evaluation to be useful to the court and to the parties involved, which is very much the practice in the US, Canada, the UK. The judge will often outline very specific issues that they want to have addressed in the evaluation. So some of the things that they may ask, they want to know what custody arrangement is in the best interest of the child. They may also want to know whether abuse, appears to exist, and what's the risk to the child or what's the risk to the other parent. And this will make a difference in terms of what kinds of recommendations a psychologist may make. They may also want a safety and lethality assessment, and I think that's something that's very important, because lots of times people tend to think that, well, if a relationship is over or the parties have separated and they're now living in separate spaces, that means that the person is safe, and that is not always the case. So you want to know whether or not the abusive partner has access to weapons, whether there are substance abuse issues, whether they are still stalking or harassing the person. So those are the things that you may want to have included as part of the assessment. I mean, if it's not a case of physical violence, or if it, then you may not need a lethality assessment. You also want to know if the person being assessed has a mental illness or mental disorder. And then if they do, whether it's the female who was being abused or the male who is the abuser, you want to know then to possibly want to know to what extent that mental illness could affect that person's parenting ability. You also then want to know what risk the condition can have for the children. So is there a risk of physical abuse towards the child because of the mental health condition? Is there a risk of emotional abuse? Is there a risk of psychological abuse or of neglect? Is the person capable of performing all of the duties that are known in international research, or at least the majority of the duties to the best of their ability that are known in international research, to contribute to the healthy development of a child? You also want to know, is there potential impact again on the child's development, and as I mentioned just now, consistent care for parents. Then if there is a mental health condition present, the court may want to know, well, is this something that's treatable? And if it's treatable, what are the options? Because again, having that information may play a role in what recommendations are made, what custody arrangements are made, what safety conditions are put in place for both the children and the person who is being abused in the relationship. Again, condition manageable, what support services and treatment are available. Now, after you as an attorney get the evaluation, and I mentioned this briefly earlier in terms of being unbiased and objective, you may want to have a good read through of the evaluation, look at what protocols were followed when the evaluation was conducted. Are these the protocols that are recommended in the literature for conducting mental health evaluations with domestic violence cases, or custody evaluations with domestic violence cases? What was the purpose of the evaluation? So again, going back to what were the issues that were identified as needing to be addressed? Right. So what were the issues that were identified as needing to be addressed, and were those issues, or have they been addressed when you read the report? So I'm going to move on now to what the report should entail. So I haven't done a custody evaluation, I think maybe in about a year, but when I do conduct the evaluations, but for custody, I'm doing interviews with both parties. If it's just mental health evaluation with one person, well, I'm just speaking obviously to that particular party. And the interviews are usually very comprehensive. Typically, you're supposed to go from early childhood right up to present in terms of finding out what that person's early childhood and development, their family of origin, what it was like for them growing up. You want to know about any illnesses that he or she may have. You want to know about their work history, their social history, if there's a history of abuse in the person who has been, so in the abuser's past, is this a pattern, is this a history for him, and the same for the other party. As I said earlier, it's also recommended in international literature that you conduct some standardized tests as well. And they must be relevant to the questions that are asked. So you don't just choose any standardized test. You want to make sure that it is going to give you information that's relevant to what you are trying to find out for this evaluation. So in some cases, IQ testing is not really recommended, but in some cases, you may need to conduct IQ testing. For example, the court may send a letter saying, we're concerned that there may be something, or a lawyer may say, I'm concerned that there may be something going on with this person. It seems as though, they're having trouble understanding what's going on in the court, or there are some other issues that we're noticing. And so the goal is not to figure out how intelligent the person is, because that generally does not have, a significant bearing. I'm saying generally, on whether or not a person is a good parent. We have good parents who span, who span the scale in terms of IQ scores. Sometimes what you may have is a person who may have an intellectual disability. And so in that case, that's something that you want to know, because then that also plays a role in terms of the recommendations that you are going to make to the court. And intellectual disability is the new term for what was previously known as mental retardation. So sometimes you may have someone, they function generally well, but then you notice issues with them in terms sometimes of being able to fully understand what's going on. They may have some difficulties in some performing some activities of daily living, things like managing money, those types of things. And you want to be able to know that, to make recommendations and to see what interventions could be put in place for that person. Very common in standardized testing for mental health evaluations and custody evaluations in general, and those involving domestic abuse, are personality tests. One of the most widely used is the MMPI. It consists of about 564 questions. So it gives you a very in-depth idea of a person's personality traits, and also of any mental health issues that they may or may not be struggling with. And knowing a person's personality traits can be important. They're said to be predictive sometimes of certain types of behaviors, right? Parenting scale. So in addition to collecting information from interviews, and you also want to ask them to complete standardized parenting questionnaires. So looking at their parenting style, what are their parenting beliefs, their parenting skills. So again, that gives you a good idea of what kinds of recommendations you make to the court, and it provides important information for all parties involved. I want to say, when I talk about interviews with both parties, I want to make it clear that these interviews are conducted separately. So I never ask a domestic abuse survivor or someone who has been in a domestic abuse relationship to sit in the same room as the person that they were in the relationship with. For many women, that is quite traumatic. I think for most women, that's very traumatic. You can start to see them, trembling. You get calls that, they can't make it, or they come and they're slouched, in the side of in the chair. They're very, very uncomfortable. So my practice is to never have someone who's been involved in domestic violence, domestic abuse relationship of any kind, unless, they've said, well, it's been a few years now, I've been through a lot of therapy. I feel as though I want to do this, but this is not something that I generally practice. Going back to standardized tests, you also want to conduct a risk assessment to see what kind of danger, if any, the children and the abused person may still be in. I also do interviews and observations with children and parents, and usually multiple observations. So what I would do is that I would have, and obviously this depends on the age of the child, if this is a child who's old enough to come and sit and interact with their parent. So I'd have them come separately with their mother and then separately with their father to see the kind of interaction the child has. So if the father, who may have been the person who was the abuser, comes and he says, no, I have great relationship with my children, everything is fine, we have no problems, their mother is putting them against me. But you have a child who's 5, 6, 7, 8, and as soon as he comes through the door, they're under the table, they are going behind the couch, or every 10 minutes they're asking to go to the bathroom. They may not verbally say anything to you, but these are certainly things to observe. And if you're seeing it consistently, it's certainly suggestive that they're, what that person is saying about having this great relationship with their child may not necessarily be true. With teenagers, they come and they sit in silence with the person. They have nothing to say. Faces turned, they're on their phones. Or, alternatively, you may have a child who does have a great relationship with their father and wants to see them in spite of the abuse that they may or may not have witnessed in their home. So those observations, I think, are very important, and I include them as part of any custody assessment involving domestic abuse. You also want to get a detailed account of the child's needs. So is this a child with special needs? Is this a child who's involved in multiple activities? Is this a baby who needs special care and attention? Is this a baby who is still breastfeeding? So in that case, what kinds of arrangements can be made? Can we say, well, okay, they're breastfeeding, but I need to have a visitation, I have rights to custody, so we need to wean them and get them on formula. Is that something that's a reasonable request to make? And I'll just mention here that in international literature, it's generally not recommended that children, I believe it's under the age of 2 or 3, to have any overnight visits with the other party because of their special needs and because of how they are attached to the other parent. Right. Sometimes the court may also request, or you as the evaluator may think, well, we also need to do some testing with this child. It looks as if there could be something going on with this child that we're not figuring out just from conversation. So do we need to do some kind of objective drawings with this child? Do we need to do some IQ testing to see? Sometimes children may have dyslexia, they may have ADHD, and so those things are also important to find out and to be able to include in your report. As I said, and they may play a role in the kinds of evaluations, kinds of recommendations that you make. Excuse me 1 second, my battery is dying. Right. And again, I spoke earlier about safety assessment and looking at risk factors. Some psychologists include as part of their assessments, they conduct home visits. I generally don't conduct home visits. Usually, if anything, I may ask that the child care board or the welfare department, because they have the experience in that area, that they can conduct home visits. If I think it's absolutely necessary, I do, but generally, and just sometimes for my own safety, going to the home of of someone who could be violent, I tend not to conduct such visits. I know from working at probation, when we did home visits, we usually did them in pairs because of safety concerns, and I work alone. Whenever possible, in addition to what I just discussed, it's good to have additional sources of information, but obviously there are pros and cons. So you may have people who, I'm supportive of one party or the other, so sometimes their information may be skewed in order to appear supportive of the person. So you can ask other family members, friends, neighbors, former partners, but just knowing that, okay, you have, as a clinician, to make sure that you evaluate that information carefully and triangulate it with other information that you get from other sources, from doctors, from teachers, counselors, pastors, if the person go to church. They can sometimes be included. You may domestic violence advocates, other professionals. If there are police reports, medical reports, dental records, to help to show, well, this person has been to accident emergency or to the doctor 10 times this year. That may be useful information to have. For children, I usually try to get reports from their teachers about just their general functioning at school, their behavior. Sometimes teachers are able to say, well, I notice on Mondays, or I notice when the child comes from the abuser's house, there's a huge difference in their behavior. They're a lot more withdrawn, or they're a lot more angry, or it takes them a lot more time to get settled for that week. So those kinds of information are also quite important. All right, so very quickly, how should mental health information be used by you? Lots of times the reason that some women are opposed or afraid to have mental health or even custody evaluations is that they're scared that any mental health information may be used against them in the proceedings. So sometimes I may get clients who come and they don't declare why they're coming. They may just say, I'm struggling with anxiety, I'm struggling with depression. And then after 4 or 5 sessions, they may say, well, what do you think of me? And I look at them very quizzically and trying to figure out why. And they say, well, I thinking of separating from my partner because of all, there's this abuse, or before they haven't said anything about the abuse. And do you think that given what you've observed and heard about me and my mental health challenges, that this could be used to keep my children away from me or to take custody of my children from me? And this is something that tends to happen a lot. Well, let me not say a lot, but I know that it happens where sometimes mental health conditions are used against women to try to say that they're not fit mothers. So, you lay in bed, sometimes a little longer on the days where you're not feeling so well, or there are days when it may be a bit more difficult. And sometimes that's more about the abuse. And when that person gets out of that abusive relationship, you find that those things very much improve. So these reports are not meant to be used by any party to discriminate or to intimidate in any way. The key question when thinking about mental health challenges on both sides is the condition dangerous for the child and even, for the other parties as well. So using this information in your case, let's say someone gets a diagnosis of a mental health condition. Can they fulfill the majority of their parenting roles? Can they prepare meals? Or can they get the children ready for school? Are they dropping off and picking up on time? Are they caring for them when they're ill? Are they ready getting them ready, helping them with homework, taking them out. Or sometimes on the other side, we have, sometimes with abusers, you may find, yes, they're abusive, but then they're also sometimes substance use issues. So we get complaints of leaving children at home at night to go out to party, or driving under the influence with a child, or children are getting to school late, or they're getting picked up from school 1 to 2 hours after they're supposed to be picked up. So really, we want the information to be used in a way that is beneficial and for the best interest of the child. And obviously for, the other party that may be involved, so the person is or was being abused. So you're using the information because you want to create a climate in which the child or the children can flourish, and safety of usually the mother, who's the one who's usually being abused, not in all cases, but usually is critical. Remembering that children tend not to flourish and do well if they perceive themselves to not be safe or their parents to be at risk. Lots of times children, even though they may not be abused, they take very much, as we say in Barbados, take on what's happening to their mother. Alternatively, if you have a parent who is fearful for their own safety, they may have a difficult time providing and being the best parent that they want to be, right? And this can obviously worsen or prolong mental health issues. So in terms of looking at recommendations to assist with safety and the best interest of the child, as I said earlier, people tend to think that, okay, you're separated, so the violence may stop, and that's not the case. Usually the risk for lethality can increase when the partners separate, because now that person no longer has that power and control that they want. So sometimes psychologists or evaluators may have to recommend, okay, we're postponing visitation until we feel as though safety is established for children and the mother, or until the person has successfully completed treatment and you have a letter from another professional saying, here's what we're seeing. Let's start with some limited types of visitation. You may also want to keep a relocation address of the person who's being abused confidential. In Barbados, because we're so small, that's hard. But there's some people who say, oh, I should know where my child lives. I'm not agreeing to these conditions, or until I know. And a lot of times it's not about knowing where the child lives. It has nothing to do with the child. Again, restricting communication. So, no calls, no visits, no WhatsApp messages. All information is either shared by a third party or via email, or in the US now, people create websites and I share it with you that way. Again, restricting contact. You have visits that are formally supervised either by someone appointed by the court, a professional, or you can have a family member that you trust. Okay. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. I don't want to run over into Dr. Price-Humphrey's time, so I will stop. There. And if there are any questions, feel free to ask. Okay. All right, so it doesn't look, Robin, like we have any questions. So I don't know if you want to take a break.
Yep, I think we could take a quick 5-minute break and come back at 6:30.
Sure. Okay, great.
Apologies for the delay. We will go ahead and get started. Dr. Price-Humphreys, as you're ready.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's been a chaotic kind of day, so I really thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of the seminar. I've emailed them my presentation because I'm having some computer trouble. So if something doesn't turn up, I'm apologizing ahead of time. Now, today I have no intention of turning you professionals into doctors. My aim is to give you an understanding of some of the factors that can contribute to the presentations you see when you're defending your client. So I will turn off my video and we'll focus on the presentation. Next slide, please. Next, right. So my aims and objectives today are quite simple. You can hear me clearly?
Yes, we can.
Yes, great. To define just briefly trauma-informed practice, and why is that? Because as lawyers, sometimes, well, in this type of setting, your interaction with your client can be frustrating, and you would want to elicit cooperation and also avoid re-traumatizing your clients. I'd like to explain a few of the many possible mental health challenges related to abuse. I discuss how these presentations can impact on your legal process and why your clients may respond in unexpected ways. Please, next. Right, so our first topic is trauma-informed care. What's trauma-informed care? Next slide. It's really understanding that the trauma, which is any adverse situation that negatively affects the individual, their behavior and interactions continue beyond the immediate circumstances. The trauma itself can be experienced, in other words, perpetuated towards the client, or witnessed, perpetuated towards another. So Dr. Cossy mentioned earlier, children observing their parents being abused, or yes, majority of the time it is male on female violence, but as was mentioned by one of the participants last week, when I had a time to chime in, every once in a while it is female on male violence, but violence within the home in general. So both the experience and the witnessed situations can be traumatic. The negative effects of this trauma can persist for days, weeks, months, or years. And the effects are indeed psychological or physical. And therefore the influence the emotions, thoughts, behavior in unrelated situations. And what that may mean is that the client comes into your office, you are to perform a service for them. And as we will go on to discuss, sometimes their behavior may be perplexing or even frustrating. Next. So why should lawyers and other professionals incorporate this mindset? For one, it makes your job less frustrating because you will have a reasonable expectation of your clients and their capacity to participate in the legal process. Once those expectations are modified, it reduces the likelihood that you will undermine your own processes, that sometimes lawyers and other legal professionals do things that they think are necessary. You're asking for time and date, et cetera, and the client seems not to participate, but you need that information to go forward. And so if you understand this, you can tailor your response in a way that allows you to actually get the best from your client and to be successful in your case. It empowers your client as well to continue. I can understand, even from us, in terms of us in mental health, we get frustrated when persons seem to give up easily. To laypersons like myself, the legal process seems to take too long. For someone who's been traumatized, it is interminable. And so we want to empower the client to continue the process. It also reduces the likelihood that your procedures will re-traumatize the client and therefore sabotage your details. You often want the time, the wherefores, etc. But for the client, reliving this can be extraordinarily painful. And it better ensures that your goals are met. And one of the things that is important is that you must understand what are the goals here. Are the goals to determine custody? Are the goals to determine divorce proceedings? Are the goals to ensure safety of one or other party? But the client must feel safe in your presence. You are their advocate, whether you're a lawyer, social worker, etc. You are your client's advocate, and therefore the client needs to feel that. They need to understand that. and not that just that you're grabbing at the next case or the next income. Next. I want to start with adverse childhood experiences. So this is not a diagnosis per se, but this is very relevant to everything that Dr. Cossy mentioned, everything that I'm about to mention. You may have heard the saying, hurt people hurt people. Children who are traumatized are at indeed high risk for either being abused or traumatizing others in adulthood. Not only that, this trauma can present both physical and mental. So an adverse childhood experience, recognize it doesn't say adverse childhood trauma, it just says experiences. And I'll go through what these experiences are. Occurs during the developmental stages.
Sorry, Dr. Humphrey, there was a little bit of a lag.
Pause, yes, I saw. Yeah, I saw. I got the alert. So I'll go over that. Any circumstance, an adverse childhood experience is any circumstance during the developmental stage.
I know Dr. Price-Humphrey is having some unfortunate trouble with her internet, so hopefully she will be back with us shortly.
I am back.
Oh,
yes,
there you
indeed.
go.
For your patience. Right. So again, any circumstance during the developmental stages of a child which negatively impacts on the physical and emotional health. And these experiences persist into adulthood. Not only that, a child born to a mother who also had adverse experiences inherits some of the associated risks. What does that mean? That you have a woman in your office who's being abused. Maybe she was abused as a child. Just by nature of that dynamic, her child then carries a risk, even so much as from the stressors that the child may have experienced while in the womb. We now know that stress is inflammatory in nature. Again, I'm not going to turn you all into doctors, but just believe me that cortisol is not good for the baby. And any adult who's had 4 or more of these experiences is at risk for dysfunction. Next. Next slide. Right, and what are some of these experiences? We started talking about abuse, and this group of sessions are all about abuse, but please do understand it's not just that. So we've had definitions today of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse and other types of abuse, as Dr. Cossy outlined. We could understand physical and emotional neglect, but for instance, your cases where the child may not be directly affected, but there are others in the household. So household mental illnesses, household dysfunction in general is also a problem. Household mental illness, so if one of the parents carries a mental illness, that increases the risk to the child, not just of illness, mental illness, but physical illness and behavioral problems as well. Exposure to domestic and societal violence. So if you are in the Orleans hearing gunshots every day, that's a risk factor. Caregiver separation, meaning the caregiver is hospitalized, ill in some way, or incarcerated. So here is where we're going to meet that type balancing act between removing a caregiver from the household or removing the child from a household. And there'll be those who say a child has a right to both parents, and indeed a child has a right to both parents, but a child also has a right to healthy parenting. So we try to balance that understanding between separation from a caregiver and a caregiver whose behavior is traumatizing, even if it's not directly to the child. I've seen circumstances where one child was removed but another remained, and both children suffered. So it's not an easy question that we in mental health have to determine in terms of what's in the best interest of the child. Hence why, as Dr. Cossy said, it's very important that you're very clear what it is you need assessed when you're asking for this evaluation. And of course, household substance abuse. If a child is witnessing substance dependence in their household, they're at risk for behavioral challenges, even if that child has never experimented. And what is said is that any person child or adult who's experienced 4 or more of these in their childhood is at increased risk, and this risk increases exponentially with each additional factor. And some of you may know persons who come from households with within the entire household, there may be 5, 6, or 7 of these factors. Next slide. And then why is this important? Because this creates a stress response. And a little stress is good, you know, preparing for an exam, preparing to be called to the bar, it's okay. Acute, intense stress is manageable, but toxic stress is not. And what is toxic stress? That is a high stress state that is persistent, and there are few mitigating factors, such as supportive teachers, supportive communities, an additional relative outside of the home that can give this child some of the resilience that it needs. So toxic stress is damaging to the child's brain. The damage persists into adulthood. So again, we're looking at these generational abusive situations where the child becomes an adult. Their brains have been permanently affected by this toxic stress. A woman who's pregnant and the stress hormones such as cortisol are often high may have a child who's slow to develop, for instance. So the child is in constant state of high alert, almost like we've been in since COVID started. Stress hormones remain elevated and are easily triggered. So you have a child who's impulsive, an adult who seems to not be able to plan appropriately because the parts of the brain that deal with executive functioning become underdeveloped. So you have children who are misbehaving and adults whom you feel as lawyers and other professionals that you can't reason with this person because that executive functioning part of the brain just didn't get a chance to develop under the toxic stress of childhood. And therefore it increases the risk for emotional, psychiatric, and physical illnesses. And adults can become numb to some stimuli, such as someone pointing a gun to your head, and excessively responsive to other stimuli, such as feeling threatened. So you're in a situation where you say something to your client that they don't like. Man, you're threatening me. You don't understand what's going on, male or female. People talking about me and they storm out of the office and you're saying to yourself, but all I did was ask them to dress appropriately for court. And you get all of this. And these persons are pleasure seeking, whether it's sex, substances, gambling, risk taking, because the normal parts of the brain that respond to regular, everyday enjoyment, it's just didn't develop properly. So this is why you will see abusers, abused children becoming abused adults, abusing their children as well. It starts, there's some veracity when people speak about generational curses. That's all I will say to that. Next slide, please. Right, so how may this present in your office or even a court? An adult client who may be overly aggressive or responds excessively to even minor disagreements, takes everything personally, frequently changes their mind about aspects of the case. And that's especially important when you're asking about details, the who, what, when, where, and why. Or they engage in self-defeating behavior. You say to the client, you try to prepare the client for court, and they do the complete opposite of what you said for them to do. And or a sense of passivity, gives up easily. And with that, I'd like to speak to you about learned helplessness. Next slide. And learned helplessness occurs in circumstances where an individual is continuously in a negative situation. You are in the abusive household. You are in the violent community with the gunshots every other day. You are in a situation where you're frequently being bullied, whether as a child or as an adult in your workplace, because there's some workplaces where bullying occurs. And the circumstance is perceived to be out of their control. That's important because as lawyers, you're in the, and social workers, I'm assuming there are a few social workers or other types of professionals in the chat, your job is to elicit some sort of change. My job as a clinician is to heal and to help. And yet you're saying, this person is saying, well, it's out of my control, so why are you bothering? It makes no sense trying to help me. Nothing will change. And the individual either stops or never tries to escape the circumstances, even when you put it right there in front of their faces. We have a women's shelter, and some women will not go because they say to themselves, well, he'll just find me there. Or what will I do when I come back out? I'll just end back up here. And as mentioned in one of your previous presentations, when I think it was last week when it was said that persons often leave 2 to 3 times before they finally leave. This is all part of that sense of helplessness. And therefore, sometimes the clients don't cooperate with your suggestions, or they return to the traumatic situation. Part of helping persons through this learned helplessness is also, if possible, allowing them to communicate with others with lived experiences and success stories. But you have to be very careful with that because the client is also in a vulnerable state. And for you, accept that it may take several attempts for a client to adequately address the situation. And some may never address the situation to the degree that you're comfortable with. All right, next. So let's talk about 2 or 3 particular circumstances. And again, I'm taking this through the lifespan. So yes, I may start with children, but I'm showing you how this persists into adulthood. And again, why hurt people hurt others. Next. So attachment is the emotional reaction of the child to the caregiver, whereas bonding is the attachment of the caregiver to the child. So when you hear a mother who's depressed and hasn't bonded with their child, and the child hasn't attached to the mother, and it increases the interaction with the caregiver, usually with one, but at a very early age, a child can attach to more than one person, but usually it's one at first in terms of in early infancy and develops gradually. Now, why is this also important? It reduces anxiety. So letting a child cry it out to a certain degree is not healthy. This child needs to understand that the world is a safe place. If they're in a circumstance where the world is not a safe place, you are then facing some difficulty. Quality of activity and time together is more important than quantity. So when you have the circumstance where the child is supposed to visit with the other parent, say the father, I'm trying to be gender neutral, but the reality is most of the time they're with the mother and visit the father. But the father is out and about, and they're really spending time with grandparents. There's no real attachment occurring between that child and their father, because he's not present, whether to spend lots of time or quality time. But the quality is more important than the quantity. And that's why you will meet children who are absolutely in love with a particular parent. And you're saying to yourself, you don't understand how this happened. But something between that parent and that child, that caregiver and that child, the quality is more important than the quantity. Next. Next slide. So just quickly, we're going to, I'm not going to spend any time on this. I'm not turning you into doctors, but recognizing I wanted you to see that attachment can occur from birth. And therefore, we want from a very early stage for caregivers to be present. When you have a woman who's in an abusive relationship or a man in an abusive relationship, and there's a newborn baby, from that point, attachment is starting. And if it's interrupted there, you have to put things in place to bring that about later on. So just, switch quickly through to the next slide, right? And the attachment continues until toddlerhood. I want to point out that in terms of clear and complex attachment, you recognize that a child who has a secure attachment may have distress when separated from the caregiver, but is able to be comforted and is able to tolerate new experiences and less anxiety with strangers as they grow. Next slide. So why is that important? A child can show these forms of insecure attachment. So again, you have a client and you have a young child, and you see in the office, your legal office, your social work office, that the child is extremely avoidant as compared with their normal developmental stage, or extremely ambivalent, they're clingy, they can't separate from a parent, or behave in a disorganized manner. So they laugh when you would expect them to cry and cry when you're expected to laugh. These are all signs that there's a problem in the household. These are things that in mental health we would try to evaluate, but it may give you a signal in your legal office that, okay, this child is behaving a little bit bizarrely. Don't just say to yourself, oh, children will be children. Yes, maybe children will be children, but this is definitely one of those cases where you would seek an expert opinion as to why this child is excessively clingy or evasive and not wishing to be near the caregiver in the way you would expect. Next slide. And a child who's deprived of a caregiver, and again, we in that balancing act between leaving a child in a home that's abusive and separating a child from a caregiver to whom they're attached, that child also can show disorders of attachment and all of the consequences there too that can persist into adolescent and adulthood. Next slide. Right, so some of these are the slides that are dysfunctional because of my internet problem. But we have some behavioral problems that occur in later childhood now. So things like, so these are primary school to adolescents, aggression to people or animals. If you see it, children usually inherently want to care for animals. So when you have a child who is behaving in a particular aggressive way towards others that are weak, perceived as weaker than themselves, then you will query what's going on. Destruction of property, deceitfulness and theft, or serious violations of rules. Those are some of the signs of delinquency that can occur in children living in abuse households. They occur in other children as well, but they can occur in these persons. And part of the challenge would be determining what, cause and effect. Is it that this child is struggling in a particular way, or is there some sort of abuse going on that maybe isn't detected overtly? Next slide. We have an oppositional child. So a pattern of angry and irritable moods, very defiant, very irritable. And again, these are primary school to into teenage years. And vindictiveness. So this is a child that always wants to get you back. They don't forget, they don't forgive. Usually children quarrel today and they're friends again tomorrow. When you meet a child that's not capable of doing that, then indeed, again, another red flag coming up. Next slide. I mentioned this in terms of changing the antecedents and consequences of behavior, because often in abusive households, there isn't the kind of support that will change the antecedents. And so sometimes we have to do that externally, hence child care board and other social workers. And I see a message from Michelle Gibson, yes, bedwetting as well. As I said, I can't, include every single thing, but if you see a child with regressed behavior, so they were continent before and now they're bedwetting, they were able to tolerate separation from a caregiver and now they're excessively clingy, or truancy, or running away from home, all of those changes in behavior are definitely signs that there's a challenge. A primary school child who stays out after dark without fear is a red flag. More so than in the teen years, yes. A primary school child who regresses to nursery school behavior, so they never used to suck their thumb before, but now they're sucking their finger. Throwing tantrums when they didn't used to throw tantrums before, or they got over that stage, all of those are signs. And the reason I put up the change in antecedents is that if the household is not supportive, if the household cannot change, then sometimes we do have to err on the side of removing the child from the circumstances. And also, if you have a household that's particularly punitive, the consequences of behavior. So every little thing, you're getting beat, cuffed, put down, definitely that is a red flag as well. Next. Just very briefly, depression and anxiety. Next. So I'm not here to, I keep saying that I'm not here to make you into doctors, even though I have all these things up. I've highlighted a few things. Now, depression isn't just sadness. Depression is a syndrome of behaviors. Yes, 5 or more, but I want you to see a change from previous functioning. And what that would mean is, again, someone comes into your office, child or adult, and they're just not the type, they're just not participating in their process. Depression is one of those things we can think of. You can have a sad mood, and that would make sense to you. But children and adolescents, that CNA, can be irritable, and so can some adults. So rather than overt sadness, you see that grumpiness and everything's a problem. We also have that there are challenges with interest in previously pleasurable activities. So you try to tell someone, oh, go for a walk on the beach and de-stress, but walking on the beach doesn't seem to do much because they're not as interested, or they just don't get that spark as they would have before. Weight loss and weight gain or failure to thrive. We have all the other things like not eating, not sleeping, etc., and definitely thoughts of death and suicide. Next slide. It can vary by age. So in children, we can see the anger and the agitation. Adolescents can be rejection sensitivity. So your association with your peers is vitally important. And so if peer relationships are damaged, then that's where the cyberbullying and etc. can really play a role. Substance use as well, and poor self-care. Next slide. And we have some anxiety disorders in which you have a general sense of being worried, tense, worked up, etc. And anxiety can be a part of depression. Next. Hello. Right. You may have excessive apprehension or worry on most days, more than internet is again doing what it wants to do without my permission. Next slide. Let's keep going. Right. So I really do want to spend a couple moments on the trauma-related disorders. And I put that icon there, a conscience will either accuse or excuse, as a way to look at both sides of the equation. Abusers excuse their behavior. In their mind, what they're doing is appropriate. And yes, intervention and therapy is very important, but recognize that without looking at the root cause, just simply punishing would not be enough. On the other hand, the victim often feels accused, and they accuse themselves as well. And so when you are trying to defend someone, to be their advocate, sometimes you have to be the one to continually and continuously reiterate, this is not your fault and you didn't do this to yourself. Next slide. Trauma is any circumstance which can elicit a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, and horror. It incorporates both the exposure to actual or threatened death, injury, or sexual violence. Again, coming back to something Dr. Cossy said earlier and something that was mentioned in a previous presentation. When a person in a household, and now I'm not just even talking about just the children, but it could be others in the household, are witnessing serious injury or sexual violence, they themselves can also be traumatized. They themselves can also feel stuck And so again, sometimes as lawyers or social workers, you may say to yourself, well, why didn't somebody else help you? And the reason being that that somebody else is also part of the trauma picture. So directly exposing the trauma, witnessing as it occurs to others, learning of actual or threatened trauma. So Dr. Cossy earlier mentioned stalking, and you've left the country or you've gone to the women's shelter, but you get a phone call, I'm outside your mother's house, I'm outside the children's school. You're going to feel traumatized and helpless by that circumstance. And again, if you're experiencing repeated and extreme exposure, witnessing the aversive details, you're seeing the cuts, you're seeing the bruises, you're seeing the broken bones. You may be the, an adult in the household not experiencing the trauma directly, but you are also being traumatized. Next slide. What happens to persons who are traumatized and experiencing traumatic symptoms? They can have persistent intrusive symptoms. Memories, dreams are distressing. Dissociation refers to when the client is re-experiencing the event. So they're in your office, you're trying to get the who, what, when, where, and why, and the client just seems to zone out and then can't have an interaction with you at all. At that moment isn't the time to push, isn't the time to accuse, isn't the time to say, well, if you really wanted him charged, you really have to tell me what to do. Because at that moment, they are being assaulted in front of you. And your behavior is also an assault to them. In their minds, they're being assaulted. It's almost like those pictures when you see the war veteran come back and they're hearing the bullets in their head, even though there are no bullets around. This is what's happening to that woman, to that child, to that man, to that son, that grown son who remembers what happened to his mother, to that grown woman who remembers what happened to her sister. They're experiencing it right in front of you. And they can have intense or prolonged psychological distress when exposed to internal, external cues. So your questioning can be secondarily traumatizing. Now, of course, you need to get your information. There's no doubt about that. But recognize that if someone is shutting down in front of you, that may not be the time, and you may have to ask for a delay, whether in your questioning or in the court proceedings. And they're extreme, the reactions can be extreme. Next. There's also avoidance. I don't want to have these memories. I don't want to have these thoughts and feelings, but I also don't want you to elicit these thoughts and feelings. I don't want to go around the particular auntie who was in the house or the grandparent who did nothing. I've had occasion to interview clients who, for what it may seem counterintuitive, but they don't blame the abuser, they blame another member of the household. Why didn't you protect me? I can't. And so the court will say, okay, go live with your grandmother, and the client, the child is hesitant, or the mother, and this is, all of my examples are actually true life cases. The mother may say, you will not send my child there. You will not say to the court that grandparent is a good place or auntie is a good place. The auntie may not have participated in violence, but in that person's mind, the auntie did nothing. Uncle did nothing. Grandmother did nothing, and they're part of the abuse cycle as well. I don't want to be reminded that she did nothing. So you're not sending me to live with them. You're not sending my children to live with them, even if from the outside, it seems like a safe place to you. They don't want to have conversations. Again, they will shut down in your office or in the court system. And there are marked changes in reactivity. So as I mentioned earlier, irritable, angry at the minor thing, but also reckless behavior. Sometimes we look at someone and go, why is it you were raped, but you're now sexually promiscuous? You were in a motor vehicle accident, but now you're driving fast down the road. You were in a gun shootout, but now you want to own a gun. Because your ability to respond to threat has been altered, and even more so if this threat started in childhood. You can be very hypervigilant, easily startled, easily feeling like you were threatened. But then there's poor concentration. So you're trying to have a conversation in your office, and the mind is wandering to other things. And definitely sleep disturbance can be one of them. Next. Negative alterations in cognition and mood. And I want to start with inability to remember important aspects of the trauma. So when a woman comes into your office and she says she can't remember what happened, she knows he hit me, or a rape victim, but can't recall how what her perpetrator looked like, or a child or adolescent who was in some way witnessed an assault but can't identify who was there or how it happened or what happened just before. That inability to remember the very things that you need to know is part of the trauma. And therefore, when they come back later, whether days, weeks, or months, or years later, and the quote unquote story changing, the story isn't changing. Their experience, their internal experience has changed. Maybe they're able to remember things they previously forgot. Maybe other things came back and were triggered again. Maybe at that moment, they quite literally just couldn't tell you what happened. And so you're walking another tightrope between getting as much information as close to the event as possible, but allowing the person to heal enough to actually give you that information. They may have persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs about themselves, others, in the world. I am worthless. You are trying to help me, but you're wasting your time. I can go to the police station and they make me feel like I was the cause. I'm going to go into court and they're going to say it was my fault. Why am I going to bother? Persistent and distorted cognitions about the cause or consequences. Yeah, I came home late, so that's why he did beat me. No, coming home late isn't the reason he beat you, but that is what's in your mind. A negative emotional state, that's the depression and anxiety we quickly zoomed over. A diminished interest in participating in significant activities, including legal processes, and a feeling of detachment from others and inability to experience positive emotions. So when you're trying to say to this person, you know, I want you to form relationships, friendships, appropriate, or change your life and start over. At that point, they may be unable to actually feel the positive emotions, the hope that life can get better. Next slide. And then at the end, we have our suicide risk factors. Suicide isn't always associated with mental illness, but suicide can be associated with any loss or distressing situations, such as illnesses, yes. But I would like to draw your line to the second line when they speak about impulsivity, when I spoke about persons who may be having a lot of risk taking, a sense of hopelessness, which can occur in trauma, poor problem solving skills. As I mentioned earlier, the part of the brain that deals with executive function is underdeveloped. History of violence, both in the family and interpersonal, and of course, not achieving goals and having an available method. So those are some of the factors that can contribute to a difficult legal process. And I see it's already 7:15, so I will stop here. And I guess myself and Dr. Cossy can entertain any questions that you have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Price-Humphrey. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to unmute your mic or use the raise hand feature. And of course, please, if you feel more comfortable, pop them in the chat.
I will also ask, because I also had some YouTube links at the end of this presentation, which you can listen to. So I'll ask our moderator to just pop that list of links in the chat for anyone who wants to copy and paste, because we can't all read all the time. So a few of those are discussions about mental health and abuse, etc. Maybe you can pop them on as you are cooking dinner. Yes, please. I see something popped up just now in the chat. Are the reports or evaluations free? In the public system, yes, but as with all free things, it means a long wait. In the private system, fees are set by the individual therapist. I think I was told lawyers have some sort of benchmark as to how you structure fees. Medicine does not have that. And so, yes, if you go to a private practitioner, you will have to pay. In the public system, it's free. But I will say that the public system doesn't do some of those evaluations that we would, let me rephrase that. It would be a multidisciplinary approach to getting the assessments. And for instance, if you were to make a request for child guidance clinic, which is a children's mental health clinic, previously hosted at the Brantford Tate Polyclinic, temporarily, I hope, back at the psychiatric hospital during the COVID. If you were to call today, the first appointment just for the child's assessment is November. And then that's for the psychiatrist. That would be me. Then we make a referral to the psychologist, and sometimes their wait may be another 2 months. At this time, there are only 2 to 3 psychologists for the entire public system, not just legal system, not just this kind of intervention, but for everything. So the wait can be quite long. I saw something else pop up.
I also want to add that the child care board psychologist also does some of these assessments, especially the custody assessment. But as Dr. Price-Humphrey says, the wait times can be quite
well, we
long.
don't make decisions on custody. We would just make, the psychologist would probably do a psychological assessment, but majority of the time, I think the custody part of it goes through the welfare department, family unit, I believe. We don't get a lot of requests from the courts for custody itself, but I've been asked to assess once or, a couple times, just the child's emotional or mental health. And that then plays a role in, I guess, the court making a decision. I see here from Anya Lord, it's easy to make decisions where the perpetrator's behavior is obvious. The most obvious example being where there's physical violence. However, my understanding of sociopathic and psychopathic individuals, that many of them are narcissists. They are adept at inflicting emotional and psychological abuse and then making their victim appear crazy or overly sensitive. They're also very good at getting people, especially the court, to buy into their narrative. How do we as observers from the outside learn to identify these type of perpetrators? Well, putting aside the technical terms of sociopathic, psychopathic, and narcissist, what you do is that if you feel as though a story is too good to be true, definitely ask for a psychological evaluation. And I think Dr. Cossy would be better able to speak to those types of evaluations, but things like personality assessments in various methods can help give an insight. As an observer, it's difficult because you would know that con artists, I'm using that in the most broadest terms, they are slick, they are convincing, they're personable, and only those who are in it know what it's like to be there. I will also caution you as well, is in that a perpetrator, if a perpetrator was also a victim of violence as a child, notwithstanding any personality disorder, narcissism, sociopathic or psychopathic behavior, they too were programmed to behave in this way. This is not an excuse, only an explanation for why it may take a long time to get to the point where you can actually get an answer. I don't know if Dr. Cossy is still on the call, and maybe she can give a better explanation to the types of assessments, but she did hint to them when she said you should really make sure that the psychologist that received the referral is a clinical psychologist and has training in testing. Is Dr. Cossy still on the call? Maybe she's better able to answer those. And to answer Michelle Gibson, yes. You have here that persons who experience childhood trauma, do they often develop borderline personality disorders? I will just say personality disorders, but again, a caveat in that if you've experienced a trauma for a long time, this personality that has evolved was nurtured, not nature. And there are interventions, very intense ones, some of which not available in Barbados, for personality disorders, particularly for borderline personality disorder. There's a type of intervention available for those persons, but it's very intensive and the client has to be willing. And that's the issue with personality disorders, of all of them, whether narcissist, borderline, histrionic, whatever others that we're looking at, antisocial, it's perceived as their personality, and therefore they're comfortable behaving this way. And it takes a lot for them to say, look, it's not working out. Let me try a different method. I see here Shane Brathwaite. This session, you're welcome, Michelle Gibson. Shane Brathwaite, this session was helpful. I have had the experience where my client was self-defeating, and this was frustrating dealing with her matter. Yes, it's frustrating for us in mental health as well, and we know what we're looking at. So I can only imagine how you in the legal fraternity feel. She felt understandably that the system was against her due to the negative experience she had in court when she was unrepresented. I would also add that that would be re-traumatizing to your client, because if they already start with a perception that I am bad, the world is out to get me, no one will believe me. As was mentioned by Anya Lord, the perpetrators can be very charming and convincing. If you then have a legal system, whether it's the police that they report to, made the first report to, the lawyer who's supposed to be their advocate, the legal system who's supposed to look at things impartially, all saying to you, well, why didn't you do something about it? Then it's very discouraging, and clients don't persist. And you as, lawyers and social workers will feel like you're running in circles because the client is not in a position to give you what you need to be successful in your case. So very much so, Shane Brathwaite, that's very common. I've had a recent situation where the client, well, in my case, patient, became angry at me because she felt that the information I provided, okay, so the backtrack, I don't provide extremely personal details in the court setting because it's not a he said, she said. But nonetheless, she felt that someone got hold of information and the whole system was out to get her. And she stormed out. And as she was storming out, even though I reassured her, I said, you're angry now, but you're also always welcome to come back. And as lawyers, I'd want you to take that mindset that they're going to be angry today or sad or self-defeating today. But if you are their advocate, always be present when, if they change their mind again and again and keep coming back, because hopefully one day they will carry through with the process. They need a hand up. They need a little bit of hand holding. And this is not to infantilize anyone, but to recognize that from infancy, their perspective on life just was not the usual. Well, not as we would like it. This is their normal. And if this is their normal, you have to meet them where they are first before they can give you what you want or what you need to pursue your case.
Dr. Price-Humphrey, I see Nyla has a hand up.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see that part. Yes, please.
Hi, good evening.
I'm having some technical issues, so yes, go ahead, Ms. Robinson.
Hi, thanks for your interesting presentation. I was wondering, do you find that if there's an emotionally abusive parent who may have inflicted this emotional abuse on the other parent and child, do you find that that's often really taken into consideration in custody and access? Like I have a situation now where it's the mother who's actually very emotionally abusive. Like, will the judge actually look at that in terms of access?
Well, I can't comment on whether the judge will look at it, but in terms of our assessments, if we find that that is the case, we would speak to that and make recommendations regarding that. One of the things I can say is that although we're here speaking about abuse, and again, all the list of abuse that Dr. Cossy put up, but women are emotionally abusive. you know the right word to say at the right time to really undermine the self-esteem, which then gives them a sense of power. So you wait till you're at the school to tell the child about the father. You are in a situation where the child or your male partner is at work, and you say something that is demasculating. Is that the word I'm looking for? Emasculating, right? So when we see that, and also there's the whole tell off your father to the good friend in front of the child when he's not there. That too impacts on the child. Whether the court takes that into account, I can't say. You are in the legal fraternity, you know more than I, but I would say that in my case, when there's circumstances where I see that occurring, I make note of it, that parenting skills need to be addressed, or interpersonal skills need to be addressed, because those things are negatively affecting the child. But then again, it is really, as you know, it is up to the lawyer and the social worker, the person who's actually there in front of the judge, to really hammer home the point that this is important. If you, the person's advocate, skids over it, then the judge isn't going to hear it. They're not going to hear it from the client because they've inculcated that negative thought pattern.
I just want to say, Naila, for us, it doesn't matter which parent is the one who is engaging in the abusive behavior. For us, it is about the best interest of the child. And so it would not matter whether it is the mother or the father who's engaging in abusive behavior. It's our job to report and make recommendations and point out what we think is in the best interest of the child.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot.
I see here another comment from Raquel Jill, that is challenging when we have a client that needs hand-holding because we're taught to keep a professional distance. The two are not incongruous with each other. I too have to keep a professional distance. I'm not going to go and physically hold their hand and hug them up and etc. But I can walk them through the process and walk next to them in terms of as a mental health professional, right? I can say to them, okay, I realize you're traumatized today. I'm going to write out for you step by step what you're going to do. I'm not going to let you rely on your memory. I'm going to give you step-by-step details. When you leave me, you're going to walk down the corridor, knock on the psychologist's door, do X, do Y. I'm going to write down her name. I'm going to write down her number, and not just say, okay, you need a psychological assessment, go to the psychologist. You need a lawyer, go to that lawyer. I may not be able to say, look, here's a particular lawyer, but I may point them in a direction for someone who's going to give them good advice. So keeping a professional distance and making sure that your client in your case, patient in my case, has everything they need to get to the next level, do not have to be mutually exclusive. The issue is that because we think of persons as having agency, of having autonomy, you think to yourself, if I tell you to go to a psychologist, what's wrong with you? Why should I now write down the phone number for you to go to the psychologist? The reason you're writing down that phone number, that person's name, and maybe even the time to call is because if you leave it to that client in their traumatized state, they're not going to do it. Then they have an appointment with you in 2 months and they haven't made any progress. And they have an appointment with you in a court and there's no report. And you feel like you're butting your head against the wall. When one little item or two little items can make your job easier. I get back to the very first or second slide when I said, you want your job to be easier. You don't want to feel stymied you will feel stymied, but not overly stymied by the process. So you can still be professional, but understand that at this point, expecting the person to act in a way that's entirely autonomous may be self-defeating. I've had persons who came to the client clinic the day before court only because it's the day before court. notwithstanding that they were given the advice months ago, right? Because it was difficult for them to overcome that challenge, to overcome that barrier. Right? So you're not getting emotionally
Dr. Price-Humphrey,
involved.
good night.
Yes, please. Yes, please. Next. Yeah,
Sorry.
sorry.
Thank you for a very informative session. This is Marsha. I just wanted to ask about, because I agree with you, in a lot of these cases, increased parenting skills are necessary. And I also agree that, you know, Black women have found ways to use their tone over the years to compensate perhaps for some of the other ways that they don't have power. What I wanted to ask about was, because I don't want us, or should we, compare or combine mediation with increased parenting skills? Because for me as an advocate, mediation in a situation of domestic violence is a downright out and out no. We
Absolutely.
do not encourage clients to
Agreed.
go through mediation with abusers, right?
Agreed.
So I just wanted to, that's
you answered the question.
That,
and I just want to, I want to reinforce that in terms of the trauma as I discussed today. You cannot, I think someone mentioned last week that you cannot mediate when you're in a position of feeling disempowered. And I'm going to add to that, when, in terms of the information on trauma, the way the person sees themselves, the world, and their future, they cannot at that moment even speak to what's in their own best interest. So no, mediation cannot work. They need someone on their behalf advocating for their best interest outright. Whether it's in terms of the emotional dysregulation, whether it's in terms of the fact that you are actually in a vulnerable position as compared to your abuser, you cannot mediate. But the details of mediation are better served by the lawyers. But and Dr. Cossy also said it, we don't put both persons in the room at the same time. That's really counterproductive. But I interrupted you, so yes, but you were saying don't conflict mediation with parenting skills. So I'm trying to understand the question, because I can still say to both parents separately, y'all need to really look at you were parented a certain way. You were beaten. Your mother tell you this. You get dressed for the party and she tell you that you can't go. You don't need to continue this into the next generation. But I'm not going to do that with both in the room, because the tension will also be there. They won't hear a thing I say. They will both be looking at each other and thinking, how can I get out of this? Or what can I get out of this? So the advice would be separately, not together, because you still want, as Dr. Cossy repeatedly said, what's in the best interest of the child. And what's in the best interest of the child are two healthy parents. Now, right now, you do not have two healthy parents. What can each side do to improve that outcome? But while the abusive dynamic is going on, that's not going to happen with everyone in the same room. Sorry.
Thank you. You answered it, because we just have a tendency sometimes in the court to, like I said, conflate the two. And when I talk about, conflation, I'm not talking about you, but I know that, women are encouraged, get over it, move past it. The child needs both parents, kind of rhetoric that we hear. And like you said, I think it is re-traumatizing and it is counterproductive. But I do agree that in a lot of these cases, parenting skills separate of, both individuals taking accountability to become stronger parents is a part of the solution. Unfortunately, because of perpetrators being, what perpetrators are, they don't avail themselves of that type of support and counseling and so on and so forth, which is, I think, something that we should consider as well when we go back to court. Who is doing what to move the situation forward and who is not.
I also want to add one thing to what you just said. If you say to either party, male or female, you need to get over it for the child's sake, that is not healthy for the child either, because what it says to the child is, well, what it does is re-traumatize the woman or man, usually woman, because it says it's your fault. That's what she hears. It's your fault that your family fell apart. Not the abuser, You are responsible. Then she takes that on. What her child also learns is, I must either be passive or aggressive. I can't be a balanced human being. So no, saying to the victim, you need to get over it for the child's sake, is neither helpful to the victim nor the child.
Thank you, Dr. Price-Humphrey and Dr. Cossy. If there are any more questions, feel free to ask them now. And if not, we will go ahead and wrap up as we are already over our time for this evening. But it was an excellent session, so I think we'll all agree that it was worth it. Okay, great. So I think we can go ahead and wrap everything up. Thank you both again for the great session this evening. Just to let you know about the next session on Thursday, we're looking at building a case management team, and that is Dr. Marcia Hines. And I also want to comment on Anya Lord's question as well, and just mention that this new session that has been added on September 2nd is actually going to try to give you a few red flags that will tell you where a matter involves a high conflict personality, and those things will hopefully help you identify them faster without having to get that information from your victim. Have a good evening, everyone, and we'll see you on Thursday.